Okay, well, here's our last class here in our learning from great theologians of the past, and after a few delays here and there for a couple of technical reasons, we're getting around to our final class, and it's on two theologians, one American, one Dutch, that are important, very important theologians, and a couple of particular favorites of mine, and also people that I happen to know have a fair degree of interest in. And so I just want to tell you why we're linking these two together, because they deal with the subject each in their own way of how broad or how narrow we need to be as far as inclusivity in our study of theology. The last time we met, we looked at the doctrine of Scripture and saw two different responses to the pressure of modernity, with its skepticism and the liberal theology that sought to accommodate to modernity. And these two theologians, J. Gresham Machen and Herman Bavinck, they said an American and a Dutch Reformed theologian, show both sides of the poles, the sort of the boundaries, if you will, that we need to walk through. Machen shows us there's a line that we can't cross, or we cease to be Orthodox Christians. Bobbinx shows us that we can truly have what scholar after scholar have noted is the Catholic with the small c spirit as we do our theology. Now, just a bit of bibliographic material. As you know, I almost always have a number of books to be able to suggest to you. And you'll notice that I have included in the material some recommendations for a particular book by Bavinck. And I want to just encourage you to read one book by each of these two theologians we're dealing with today, put them on your must-read list. Machen's Christianity and Liberalism, we'll talk more about this. This has been listed in the top 100 books written in the 20th century. I would put this on your must-read list. The other book is a book that has come out in two different titles, but it's the same book, same translation. One is called Our Reasonable Faith, a Survey of Christian Doctrine, and it was this is an older printing of this. There's a newer printing called The Wonderful Works of God, which was originally the Dutch title that Bavinck published it under, and it's still a substantial book, over 500 pages. It's his own summary designed for a more popular audience of his theology, of his four-volume Reformed dogmatics. Now, if you investigate, there is a one-volume summary. They've summarized and condensed his one volume is 4 volumes of his Reformed dogmatics. That's not the same book. The 4-volume Reformed dogmatics, even when it's condensed into one volume, is a more technical, scholarly piece of work. This is a popular work. No footnotes, lots of scripture. But Bavinck is seeking to bring his Reformed theology for a popular audience. And as I said, if I could sort of hogtie every serious church Christian or every church leader and say, here are 2 books you must read if you're going to be a serious Christian or a leader in the church, I would recommend Bavinck's Our Reasonable Faith or The Wonderful Works of God. I've given you a link in the notes so that you can get it, and Machen's Christianity and Liberalism. Now, as far as biographical information about these two authors, there are 2 popular level biographies of Machen. One, the classic, one by his colleague, Ned Stonehouse, J. Gresham Machen, a biographical memoir, or a shorter version, J. Gresham Machen, A Silhouette by Henry Corey, you also knew him. Herman Bavinck, there is a nice popular level biography. It's fairly substantial. It's almost 500 pages by Ron Gleason, an American pastor. Herman Bavinck, pastor, churchman, statesman, and theologian. Now, there have been some other biographies. Darrell Hart has written a new, more scholarly biography of Machen, and he's a very fine scholar in that field. And James Eglinton has written a new biography. It's just about ready to come off the press, more scholarly biography of Bavinck. But these biographies are good popular biographies. As far as some material on Bavinck, for example, there's an interesting little book called A Guide to the Writings of Herman Bavinck by a man named Eric Brisley, and it gives you all kinds of information about his writings. He has some popular level works that are available, such as A Sacrifice of Praise, which is a little set of communion meditations, and also a little booklet called The Certainty of Faith. These are more popular level books. Now, Bobbinck's own major theology was a 4-volume thing called Reformed Dogmatics. This is volume 3, Sin and Salvation in Christ. Most of them are about this thick. One of them, the one with the final indexes and all the bibliography, is fatter than these. But each one of these, for example, this one is close to 600 pages, which gives you 4 volumes. So he's got well over 2,000 pages of dense but readable theology that interacts with almost everybody up to the time he wrote those in the early 20th century. So, having said that, given you some information, let's now turn to look at them. We're going to start with background to Machen. As I said, these are areas excuse me, that I know something about. Particularly Machen. My own doctoral thesis was written in the time period in which Machen operated. I didn't work particularly with Machen, but I worked at the Presbyterian Church during this time. And Bavinck, I have a particular family connection because the movement he was associated with in the Netherlands, my own family had roots in that movement. Let's look at Machen. Machen struggles in the so-called mainline Presbyterian Church. The technical name is the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. It was the so-called Northern Presbyterian Church because most of the churches were in the northern or western part of the country, as opposed to a different body which was primarily in the South. Those actually didn't reunite until the 1970s here in the United States. But Machen's own struggles came as a result of 40 plus years of struggle in that denomination. The denomination in which Machen lived and worked, the PCUSA, had a long history of Reformed orthodoxy and had seminaries such as Princeton, where Machen studied and taught, and other seminaries that were staffed heavily by Princeton grads, because Princeton was the main scholarly seminary of the PCUSA. But the church gradually began to have its own struggle with a liberal spirit. Now, many have traced various aspects of it, but most people start with the 1869 merger of what is called the Old School branch of the Presbyterian Church, which was connected with Princeton, Charles Hodge, who we've mentioned before, Warfield's roots, who we looked at before, were in that body of the church, and a more broadly evangelical, more revivalistically inclined, yet still evangelical body of Presbyterians called the New School. And many have pointed out that while the New School was theologically orthodox, it had a more broader perspective on how to do theology and a more broader perspective on the church. What this meant is that during the 1870s to the 1890s, there were a series of heresy trials that, interestingly enough, the conservatives won almost all of these in the PCUSA. There were professors, primarily, or pastors, who began advocating aspects of doctrine which were seen as heretical. For example, the Swing trial. David Swing in the 1870s was a Chicago pastor who was really slippery because he didn't say things in clear ways, but he was finally deposed from the church he was pastoring, and he was tried and deposed and the main man who led the heresy trial was a Princeton-trained theologian named Francis Patton. There was the Henry Preserved Smith trial at Lane Seminary. The most famous of them, all of them in the 1890s, was the trial of Charles Briggs at Union Seminary. And this made front-page newspapers all over the United States. But the bottom line of this series, and these are just the main ones, there were a number of smaller heresy trials, is while the PCUSA was retaining its orthodoxy, there was a certain group of people in the church who became tired. Now, we have to remember that while the numbers of liberals was actually quite small, there was a large body of essentially evangelical folks who just tired of talking about theology, tired about heresy trials, And they began to advocate what we might call can't we just all get along approach. And they would say things like, let's just preach the Bible. Let's do the more important work of the mission of the church, preaching the gospel, saving souls, doing mission work. And what drove these broad evangelicals was often a concern for efficiency in missions. This is the particular area that I worked on. My own doctoral thesis was on the so-called moderate evangelical party in the Presbyterian Church USA and their drive for efficiency in missions. Oftentimes they applied business models to the church, and they downplayed the importance of theology. This was further fed by what you might call the minimalistic theology of late 19th century revival preachers such as D.L. Moody and Billy Sunday. Now, Billy Sunday and D.L. Moody were theologically orthodox in all the main points of doctrine, but they had an approach that downplayed theology other than a few bare, minimal, central core beliefs. Moody, for example, said three ABCs of theology, 3 R's he called them: ruin, redemption, and regeneration. Didn't need to know much more than that. Billy Sunday, when he was ordained in the Presbyterian Church, in the Chicago Presbytery, kept passing on all the theological questions and saying things like, oh, boys, that's too deep for me. They would ask him another question. Oh, boys, that's too deep for me. I don't know that. It's way too deep for me. So finally, an old pastor stood up and said, brothers, this man has been used to save more souls than all the rest of us, so we need to go ahead and ordain him. That's symptomatic of the idea that it didn't matter if there wasn't much theology, except for a very minimalistic core. What mattered is these guys were, quote, saving souls, doing missions, and they were doing it effectively and efficiently. Many people started saying these are the models as the way the church, particularly the Presbyterian Church USA, should operate. In 1906, for example, the church revised the historic Westminster Confession of Faith in its chapter 3 on the doctrine of God's sovereignty and God's decree and the doctrine of predestination. Now, many argued that the confessional basis of the church had not been changed at all. They just softened it, if you will, a little bit. But B.B. Warfield, who was very much opposed to this, said, indeed, they had changed it. The softening, if you will, to make it more compatible to those of more Arminian-leaning theology was a real serious change. And it was just shortly after that that a group that had splintered off 100 years earlier, called the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and really taught a very explicitly Arminian theology, rejoined the main body of Presbyterians. Warfield argued this showed that the PCUSA was really no longer operating as a fully, strictly confessional Reformed church. Now, starting then in 1906, for the next roughly 20 years, this would begin to snowball. The trajectory of this would mean that more and more of some of the seminaries, not Princeton, but some of the other seminaries, and there were about eight or nine Presbyterian seminaries scattered around the United States. Some of the seminaries began hiring people who were softer on a lot of doctrines. There were presbyteries that started ordaining people who were fuzzy on doctrines, and it reached its peak, for example, in 1924 with the famous Auburn Affirmation. What the Auburn Affirmation was a statement signed by several hundred Presbyterian ministers and theology professors that said such doctrines as the full inspiration of the Bible, the penal substitutionary view of the atonement, the virgin birth of Christ, the literal second coming of Christ were mere theories in their orthodox presentations. And those traditional views being just theories were not binding, they said, on ministers and elders who might have other theories and how to explain them. Well, this caused a major furor, and the church established something that was nicknamed the Peace Commission to try to deal with this. Because it was clear that in 1924, when this was signed, that the church was on a collision course between those who held far more liberal views than any Orthodox Christians would normally have seen as acceptable, and the historic confessions of the Presbyterian Church. What the Peace Commission did, which was ironically, the chairman was a very conservative evangelical man himself, and a large majority of the members of it were broad evangelicals. But they were willing to paper over the differences between, the huge differences between liberal versions of the faith and historic orthodoxy, all in the name of efficiency for missions. My own, as I said, my own doctoral thesis worked heavily in this. And there were people, my favorite one was a man named Albert Francis Magaro, who called himself a church efficiency expert. And he would go around and lecture around the country in all different Presbyterian churches and lecture in Presbyterian seminaries. How do you make your church more efficient? Applying business models. You remember, if you're familiar with the old story Cheaper by the Dozen, the movie where the guy's an efficiency expert and he stopwatches everything, and this is the heyday of efficiency in business, F.W. Taylor and others. Well, the church was applying this model from the secular business world. Let's make the church efficient to do missions. Theology is inefficient. We can't gum up the works with this. The Peace Commission's report was accepted, and basically nothing happened to all of those who had signed the Auburn Affirmation. And this was in the middle of the same time period when other denominations, the Baptists, the Methodists, others were also going through severe struggles on how much orthodoxy is required of ministers and leaders in the church. It sometimes goes down in history as known as the fundamentalist modernist crisis, but the Presbyterian Church would be one of the places where it was played out in great detail. Into that context comes J. Gresham Machen. There's his dates for you on the notes, 1881 to 1937. He died actually on January 1st, 1937. He was born in Maryland, Baltimore to be exact, to a well-to-do family. His father was a lawyer. His mother was from Southern stock, originally from Macon, Georgia, and there have been all kinds of attempts to say, to link Machen, some of Machen's attitudes on things to his mother's Southern stock. His mother was quite proud of her Southern Georgia heritage, but that's for another story. But he was, as I said, from this wealthy family, received a fine education, attending as an undergraduate Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where as a college student he majored in classics, Greek and Latin, and he stayed for a year of graduate studies in classics, studying with one of the best Greek scholars then teaching in the United States. He then, as a devout Presbyterian, feeling a call to the ministry, entered Princeton Seminary in 1902. And while he was there, he not only studied at the seminary, but he also earned a master's degree in philosophy at the neighboring Princeton University, which is just right across the street from Princeton Seminary. While at Princeton, he studied with B.B. Warfield in theology and some of the other scholars, well-known scholars that were there, but he was particularly close to the New Testament scholar W.P. Armstrong, who was a highly respected New Testament professor there at Princeton Seminary. Well, Armstrong in particular, but the whole faculty recognized the scholarly abilities that Machen had and advised him to spend some time in Europe, which was one of the few places you could go to get advanced graduate study. The United States only had, basically, the University of Chicago was the only place that you could find advanced graduate study at that time here in the United States. So he went to Europe for 2 years, where he studied theology under the noted liberal theologian Wilhelm Hermann, who was always described by everybody as a charming man. He would present his liberal Schleiermachian kind of theology in the most winsome sort of ways. But he also studied New Testament under Johannes Weiss and Wilhelm Buset, two of the most influential liberal New Testament scholars who were at the forefront of seeking to reconstruct the life of Jesus. And what we mean by that is basically saying almost none of it is historical, all of it is myth and fable and just pious stories, and there's only a tiny little kernel of truth in the New Testament. So these are the people Machen studied under, because that's what you would do when you would study theology in university settings. These men all taught in well-respected universities in Germany. Now, Machen seems to have had a minor crisis of his thinking. In particular, Herman's influence seemed to be the strongest. He didn't really resolve this until he came back and during his first year of teaching, we'll learn at Princeton, and we will learn about that in just a second. It was Herman that almost brought him over to this liberal version of the faith, because Herman presented such a warm, devotional approach to liberalism that talked so much of the personal relationship with Jesus. It was very much like Schleiermacher in that sense, who we've looked at before. That Machen almost capitulated to liberalism, but he drew back. He sensed there was something not right with him. When he came back to the United States after a brief stint as a supply preacher, he was offered a position first as a lecturer in New Testament at Princeton. Now, what that meant was he was not an actual professor. He was a lecturer teaching beginning Greek classes and some beginning New Testament history classes, because he was still struggling. And Armstrong had hoped that Machen would get this resolved. And the way he did is he offered Machen this lecturing position and said, okay, we want you to take this, teach the basic Greek classes and a few other basic classes in New Testament. And as you wrestle through this, if you come to the conclusion that you no longer can teach classic Reformed Orthodoxy, we understand, and you can resign and will not stay, because it wasn't a tenure track position. But during this time, Machen became fully convinced of Orthodox Reformed theology. And he was then offered an actual job in a tenure track position at Princeton, where he became highly regarded as a teacher. He was apparently a bit of a character. They said he would do things like he would balance a book on his head as he listened to the teachers recite their Greek lessons. And he eventually wrote one of the, for years, the dominant book on introductory New Testament Greek, New Testament Greek for Beginners by Machen. I believe it's still in print. I know I used it years ago, and it was a very highly regarded book on New Testament Greek. But it's while he was in his tenure, from when he became professor at Princeton during the 19-teens and 1920s, that the great crisis in the PCUSA between liberalism and Orthodox Christianity entered into the debate. Machen entered into that debate with great gusto and great success. He wrote some blockbuster sort of books. His best-selling book is the one I pointed earlier, Christianity and Liberalism. A book that's, interestingly enough, there was an agnostic journalist that Machen happened to know from his days growing up in Boston, Walter Lippmann, who, or rather growing up in Baltimore, who said Machen was essentially correct. Lippmann was an agnostic. He was not a Christian, a professing Christian of any sort. But he said, Machen is right. You have to choose between liberalism or Christianity. And that was Machen's thesis. As I said, it's been listed by Christianity Today, World Magazine, for example, as one of the top 100 books written in the 20th century, which is why I highly recommend all of you, read this book to get an understanding of what the choice is between liberalism, even versions that call themselves liberal Christianity, and basic Orthodox Christianity. Now, Machen didn't just write that book. He wrote other books. For example, The Origin of Paul's Religion, because among the people he studied under, for example, Johannes Weiss and William Bosset, these men had argued that Paul was really the inventor of Christianity, and what Paul invented wasn't anything like what Jesus taught or who Jesus said he was, but Paul just kind of invented this out of some of his own experiences and ideas, and so Paul is really the inventor of Christianity, not Jesus. Machen took that on and said, no, there's a direct line of continuity between the Jesus of the New Testament and the Apostle Paul, and Paul is the clear developer, used under the inspiration of God, Machen, of course, would have said, of who Jesus is and was and what he came to do, and not the inventor of Christianity. He wrote the classic book on the virgin birth of Christ, because one of the hotly debated topics was Jesus really virgin born? In the Auburn Affirmation, there were people who claimed to be Presbyterian ministers, for example, said that the traditional view of the virgin birth of Christ that those of us who are Orthodox Christians believe the New Testament teaches, is found in the historic creeds such as the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, born of the Virgin Mary, was just a theory. And it wasn't necessary to believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. And Machen took this on. It's a big book, like 300-400 pages, and it really hammers away at all the so-called arguments and demolishes them, and is still pointed to as, even though the book is over 100 years old, as the definitive book on the virgin birth of Christ. He also wrote a number of popular level books, was a regular contributor to popular level periodicals. And many of these have been anthologized in various collections. He wrote his book, What is Faith? Christianity in the Modern World, a survey of the New Testament. But he became the defender, if you will, the key defender, shall we say, of Orthodox Christianity. And he was so much so that during this period is when the famous Scopes monkey trial, as it was called, took place in 1927 in Tennessee, in which William Jennings Bryan, by the way, there's a horrible movie, Inherit the Wind, which is based on this, and if you ever watch that and think you're getting anything historically accurate, it's not. It's a really bad movie, even though the actors are good, like Spencer Tracy and some others who take place in this. But there had been a college named after William Jennings Bryan in Dayton, Tennessee. And Machen was offered the presidency of this because this college, Bryan College, still exists today, is an evangelical college, was seen as a key place or historic fundamentalist, as it was often called, Christianity was being taught. But Machen turned it down, and he said he really didn't believe he was a fundamentalist, but really just an Orthodox Calvinist. However, Machen's desire to be at Princeton, to defend historic Reformed Christianity, would run into the buzzsaw, if you will, of church politics. Because when the floodgates had been opened in the mid-1920s, they had already been building, but the Peace Commission had basically in 1925 opened the floodgates for more liberal viewpoints to not be challenged at all. Eventually, Princeton Theological Seminary's board, at the behest of the General Assembly, was reorganized. And the president of Princeton was someone who was an evangelical moderate. His name was Ross Stevenson. He was not a liberal, but he was a very broad evangelical moderate. And the board was explicitly given the instructions that it must reflect the, quote, diversity of belief found in the PCUSA. During that period, Machen was nominated for the position of professor of apologetics, but the new board turned him down, saying he was too cantankerous, basically, too strident, and didn't reflect all of the breadth of the church, even though the overwhelming majority of the faculty heartily approved of him. Now, what this meant, Machen having this job appointment turned down, the board being reorganized, clearly they were going to be adding faculty members who disagreed with the historic trajectory of Princeton Seminary. Machen and 4 other key faculty members could foresee that the historic Reformed theology of Princeton was being undermined, and they left in 1929 to form a new seminary, Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia, which was an independent seminary that still exists. The goal of Westminster was to uphold the old Princeton theology, which it has since then, and it has been a strong influence on modern Orthodox Protestantism of every type in the U.S., and it's one of the key scholarly centers when much of evangelical Protestantism was frankly quite shallow in its serious study. Now, Westminster graduates sometimes had difficulty getting ordained in a few presbyteries, but that wasn't really too much of a problem. A few of them had a few difficulties, but Westminster grads were being ordained in various presbyteries. That's where ordination takes place in the Presbyterian church government. The real problem came as the result in the early 1930s of a commission known as the Hocking Commission, which wrote a book called Rethinking Missions. The Hocking Commission was all about foreign missions. when they combined the Hocking Commission, evangelicals did, and looked at it, in addition to anecdotal reports that were coming from around the world, evangelical conservatives began to realize that the missionary arm of the church contained many liberals, the most famous one being the China missionary Pearl Buck. Now, what the Hocking Commission in its report, Rethinking Missions, argued was that mission work was less about preaching the gospel and bringing people to be converted as much as educating them, working alongside traditional religious groups, providing help of various sorts. In other words, the Hocking Commission took all the teeth out of historic approaches to missions. And when evangelical and Orthodox people in the Presbyterian Church began complaining to the head of the mission board, Robert Speer, who was a confessed evangelical himself, he had written articles in a set of little booklets called The Fundamentals, which was the fundamentalist crisis got its name from that. These were a set of little booklets setting forth historic views of the faith sent to every minister in the United States that they could find a mailing address for. Speer seems to have been a classic example of one of the broad evangelical missionaries, or mission executives, who believed the core of the Orthodox faith, but was unwilling to draw any lines anywhere. And he kept denying that there were any real liberals in the Presbyterian Missionary Board. Well, this went on for 3 or 4 years, and conservatives began to realize that their money being given to missions was going to support missionaries who didn't believe anything of the historic gospel. People like Pearl Buck, who seemed to have been so wishy-washy nobody knew exactly what she did believe. So in 1934, they organized a board called the Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions to channel their funds to Orthodox, with a small o, Presbyterian missions. And many presbyteries began saying, some presbyteries were very happy about this, but there were a number of presbyteries that began to say, no, we are a connectional church. You cannot give your money to an independent board. You need to give your mission money to the official Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions. The PCUSA Mission Board obviously saw it as a challenge to missionary money. And finally, they got something passed in 1935 at the General Assembly that said anyone who didn't support denominational missions, this was passed at the General Assembly, was as much in violation of their ordination vows, any pastor or elder, as if someone who refused to take the Lord's Supper. This was upheld by the Presbyterian General Assembly because it was, of course, protested at the next year. And Machen and a few others were found to be tried for basically insubordination. They had another technical term called contumacy, but it's basically insubordination to their ordination vows, and we had their credentials as Presbyterian ministers taken away from them. What this meant is, in 1936, Machen led to the founding of a new denomination, the denomination that I'm a member of, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Now, you would have assumed that all Bible-believing Presbyterians would have said, oh, great, let's follow Machen. But surprisingly, only a small group did. Even members of the board of Westminster Seminary, which had already been in existence for 7 years, where many of them were hesitant, the majority were hesitant. One of the faculty members resigned because he didn't want to follow Machen into a new church. They saw it as schismatic, and they were convinced they should try to remain within the mixed body that the Presbyterian Church USA had become and try to fight for orthodoxy from within. Now, the OPC was founded. It has a long, interesting history, and we don't have time to pursue all of that, other than to say what John Piper, who's written a nice little biographical sketch in his The Swans Are Not Silent series, says about the OPC that it has had a witness far out of proportion to its size, and by that Piper says a witness for historic Reformed orthodoxy. What this meant for Machen, though, was that he was now isolated and somewhat alone. And he was now left with a small group of followers, a small struggling seminary, a small group of followers who themselves weren't always united on a number of things, and in the next few years there would be a lot of internal turmoil between some followers. But Machen was rather worn out by this. This is in 1936. He was asked over the Christmas break to come to help give some support to some struggling churches, and of all places, rural North Dakota. And his friends suggested he not go. They said, "You look worn out. We think this is too much of a burden." But he couldn't say no, he said. He went out there, and this was rural North Dakota. Late December, it was 20 below zero, and he caught pneumonia, got very sick, and he died on January 1st in a Bismarck, North Dakota hospital of pneumonia. The last thing that he supposedly said was as he was passing in and out of consciousness, something of the effect, "Isn't the Reformed faith grand?" And his last written communication was something he sent to his colleague at Westminster Seminary: "So grateful for the active obedience of Christ. No hope without it." The active obedience of Christ is the fact that Christ perfectly lived a godly life and fulfilled the law for us. So Machen was only in his 50s. He was a bachelor, had no family per se, had some brothers, of course. He was a warm, gregarious bachelor who often lived oftentimes in the upstairs in the same room where the students the single students. He would oftentimes on Friday night would invite students to come in, and he would have soft drinks and snacks for them, and they would play checkers, they would play other games. He told a lot of jokes, but he was also very determined and sometimes not always the most diplomatic in dealing with people whom he disagreed with. Personally, he had some other interesting things. He was an avid mountain climber most of his adult life. He particularly loved the Swiss Alps, and also an avid college football fan. He would buy huge blocks of tickets to Princeton University football games in the days when the Ivy League at Princeton belonged to was the premier football league in the United States. As I said, he came from a wealthy family, and oftentimes he funded some of the projects like Westminster Seminary in its early days, primarily out of his own personal finances. He was also, interestingly enough, a radical civil libertarian and an opponent of prohibition, which, remember, this is in the 1920s and early 1930s when a lot of this is going on. And rumors got started around that said that his family had made money in the liquor business, and that's why he opposed prohibition, which wasn't true, but these rumors died hard. And he was oftentimes had to defend himself for being opposed to prohibition. He opposed it on civil libertarian grounds. He didn't think it was the government's job to tell people whether they could or could not use alcoholic beverages. He was also a strong advocate of private parent-run Christian schools. Well, that's having given you this little summary of Machen's life. It's important, I think, to see how Machen's key theological contribution, showing us the boundaries of orthodoxy, are set in a context when those very things are being challenged. His own theology was essentially the same orthodox theology had been taught under Warfield. He had studied with Warfield, and Warfield had been taught by the Hodges. And so this long tradition of historic Reformed theology known as the Princeton theology. Now, unlike Hodge or even Warfield, we don't see the personal devotional side of Machen very much. And John Piper, who wrote a very nice biographical sketch of him, sort of challenges us and said, well, we wish we saw that. He says he doesn't talk about his prayer life, for example. He doesn't talk about his personal devotional life, which both Hodge and Warfield, even though they were strict, serious theologians, what oftentimes gives us glimpses of. But being in this strong tradition of Princeton theology, I think we should rightly assume that Machen also had that. What Machen's strength, though, was like that of his mentor, B.B. Warfield, was to do the in-depth historical work necessary to debunk the liberal ideas. His work is impeccable, serious, historically based, exegetically sound work that debunks the liberals' claims that what they're doing is serious scholarships. People who don't like Machen and didn't like Machen during the time in which we live oftentimes referred to him snarkily as the brainy fundamentalist, because he was a serious, smart guy. He was willing to work with some people that are labeled as fundamentalists, but he didn't really like the title. He was somewhat critical of some of them because he said they didn't do serious scholarship. They were only interested in pious devotional literature. They didn't have precise doctrine sometimes. For example, while Billy Sunday may be preaching up a storm and with his hellfire and brimstone sermons, his stone theology was really weak. Many fundamentalists much preferred short little doctrinal statements rather than the full-length historic creeds, and Machen didn't like that. He didn't like its dispensationalism. He was not a dispensationalist, was not even a premillennialist. He disliked that. He said it wasn't biblical. And he also disliked what he called the hang-ups on alcohol and tobacco that he found driving so much of fundamentalism. He once said when he saw a bunch of Princeton students enjoying their cigars, he wished he had taken up smoking, because he said it seemed to bring them so much pleasure and so much conviviality among the students. And he just didn't like this, what he called the hang-ups on certain things that were extra-biblical. In that sense, he was a civil libertarian. But what he so clearly saw and wrote about in his most popular book, Christianity and Liberalism, the one that I've recommended highly that you read, was that there were really two distinct religions, and that liberalism in its so-called Christian form was not really just another version of Christianity, but was really an entirely different religious belief system. Now, he was nuanced, and he didn't say that all liberals taught everything that should be consistent with their liberal assumptions. He was grateful that many of them did not. But he systematically walked his way through six doctrines. First of all, six topics. First of all, the topic of doctrine, then Christ, God and man, the Bible, salvation, and the church to prove his point. He basically said liberalism was not so much as different ideas as a shift of a totally different atmosphere. He quoted that from a prominent liberal minister. Totally different starting point. For example, he said on the subject of doctrine, he demonstrates that the liberal attempt to have a non-doctrinal Christianity, because that is something many of them simply said. Christianity is all about life. It's not about doctrine. It's about experience. It's not about doctrine. It's about living well. It's not about doctrine. They had various ways they said that. And he basically, Machen said, this is impossible. You cannot talk about a personal relationship with Jesus unless you know what Jesus you're supposedly having this relationship with. He says you cannot follow Jesus as your Lord and teacher unless you have clear ideas of who Jesus is. And even liberal ideas, he says, are doctrinal ideas, whether you admit it or not. He was highly critical of what he called the pragmatic view of truth that liberals operated under. In other words, what is true is what works. He said liberals could claim they believed the historic creeds, but what they really meant is they believed them in an extremely symbolic sort of way, not in any plain sense sort of way. When he talked about Christ, Machen said that this is just an extension of the first topic, the topic of doctrine. Jesus, Machen said, who does not perform miracles, does not teach distinctive doctrines, does not teach distinctive ethics, doesn't die a redemptive death on the cross, and doesn't rise again, simply, Machen said, cannot be squared with the New Testament portrayal of Christ without leaving those documents, the New Testament documents, in total shambles. What liberals, he said, believed about the Bible is that they have swapped experience for biblical revelation, and that the experience they claim to be operating is nothing to do with Christian experience, but is a kind of a generic, vague feeling of religiosity, is what today people would say. Oh, I'm not religious. I'm not a religious person. I'm just spiritual. And Machen really basically saw this over 100 years ago, or almost 100 years ago, because the book was written in 1923. Machen said, you can't have vague spirituality and call it Christianity. On the doctrine of salvation, he shows that the liberal religion, with its extremely weak ideas of sin and grace, really have no salvation other than their own self-salvation based on their own religious experience. He says the historic Christian message is one of hope to men and women who understand their need for grace and forgiveness. But the liberal message is entirely different and leaves us hopeless when facing the wrath of God against human sin. Overall, Machen simply dismantles the liberal claim to be Christian in any historic sense and says that honesty should compel them to leave the various churches founded on evangelical principles and stop propagating their alternative religions when funding had been set up, he said, in good faith to propagate orthodoxy. What he meant by this is many of the churches, in fact, he would say all of the churches had been started by people who believed the historic Orthodox faith. He said he wasn't really just talking about Presbyterian churches. He said Baptist churches were started by people who believed the historic Baptist faith. Methodist churches were started by people who believed the historic Methodist faith. Episcopalian churches were started by people who believed the historic Episcopalian faith, or historic Anglican faith in the Anglican tradition. But he said when liberalism takes over, it uses buildings and funds and trust money that had been given to propagate and teach historic Christianity, and is using it to teach something fundamentally opposed to that. He argued strongly that the pragmatic, anti-doctrinal attitude of many who said they believed the historic doctrines played right into the hands of liberals. In other words, he's really critical of the broad evangelical stream that said, well, why don't we just all get along? Why don't we stop arguing about doctrine? Why don't we just all live and let live and get on with the mission of the church and help people and preach the Bible? And he would say, well, how are you preaching the Bible? Machen argued on the basis of 2 Corinthians 10, 4 and 5, that we have a mandate to argue in the realm of ideas, and we are shirking our task if we don't. 13 years before the Orthodox Presbyterian Church was founded, he suggested that if the liberals failed to leave, and that's what he was basically arguing for. Liberals, he said, should leave. They don't believe the teachings, but he said if they don't believe, we who are Orthodox and evangelical in the true sense, not wishy-washy evangelicals, will have to leave. Because he said the two religions are incompatible, and that's exactly what he was forced to do in 1936. And the OPC has stood as a church that has stood for Orthodox theology ever since. Machen was there to lead it in its direction. So, if we have Machen, our scholar who stands for clear boundaries, liberalism or historic Christianity, now we want to turn to Herman Bavinck. A little bit older man than Machen. Actually, he's about the same age as Warfield that we looked at before, just as Machen would be about the same age as Karl Barth whom we looked at before. And if Machen was someone who protested within a mainline denominational structure and was eventually kicked out, Bavinck was the son of a secessionist movement against such liberalism in the 19th century Netherlands. And this is something, whereas my own denominational connection is in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, I have family ancestral roots in this Dutch secessionist movement known as the Afscheiding in the Netherlands. And so I have some great interest in Herman Bavinck. Interestingly enough, the Netherlands as a country had long been one of the most tolerant nations for divergent beliefs. Yet it was also one of the bastions of Reformed Orthodoxy during the 17th and 18th century. Now, there were two types of Reformed Orthodoxies in the Netherlands. Sometimes they overlapped. Some theologians were in both camps, but there were really two types. One was what we call the High Orthodox wing, just like as we saw before John Owen overlapped both a couple of different wings. The High Orthodox were interested in precise technical theology. They taught in universities. But there was also a devotional, it's called a pietistic wing that's been compared to English Puritanism, and that movement was called the Nadere Reformati, which in Dutch means the further Reformation. The pious Orthodox writers associated with that movement, and there were a number of them, those writers are referred to as the oude schrijvers by the pious Dutch common folks who cherished them, who loved their writings. They loved the writings of the oude schrijvers. And interestingly enough, it's been called a version of Dutch Puritanism because they also loved the English Puritans, and many of them translated out of English into Dutch works of the English Puritans, so that there was a lot of cross-fertilization. And the common folks oftentimes would meet in small groups and would read these works of the oude schrijvers, as they called them, in their small groups and would discuss them. They would read the Bible passages, they would read the devotional writings, orthodox but very heart-searching devotional writings. Now, liberal thought gradually entered the Netherlands in the 18th century, and some of the most advanced skeptical thinkers, actually, such as Spinoza and Descartes, lived there. But it wasn't until the upheavals of the Napoleonic Wars in the first 2 decades of the 19th century that liberal thought began to make great headway in the theology of the Dutch Reformed Church. Napoleon was defeated in 1814, and this had political ramifications. The Netherlands had been part of Napoleon's great empire, and after Napoleon was overthrown and Europe was all reconfigured in 1814, the Netherlands was given its independence, and it was actually merged with Belgium at that time in the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. And the Dutch Reformed Church was given a new constitution. And it was reorganized under a new church order, and it was given a new name. I've written the names down here. It went from being called the Gereformeerde Kerk, which is the classic Dutch name for a Reformed church, to the Hervormde Kerk. Now you might say, what's that mean? It also means reformed, but it means something more like reorganized rather than reformed. The two they're kind of synonyms, but they have slight nuances of meaning. And while the church was technically independent of the state and religious freedom was constitutionally guaranteed, the new church order that was developed in the Netherlands had a different form of subscription to the classic 3 creeds. The classic Dutch Reformed creeds were the Belgic Confession of Faith, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Canons of Dort. Now, previously, officers, elders, deacons, and pastors and theology professors would sign every year, they called it the form of subscription, that they believed that these documents taught the doctrines of Scripture. The revised church order changed the wording and said, you taught these things insofar as they agreed with Scripture. Now, that may sound nice and pious and devout. However, it opened the floodgates for liberal thinking, which was just around the corner. And within just a matter of 5 or 10 years after this new church order, university faculty started reflecting doctrinal teachings that were quite a bit removed from historic Reformed orthodoxy. And when asked, the liberal theology professor said, well, I signed a statement that said I believe these doctrines as far as they agreed. And I don't think one man went so far as to say, I don't think they teach hardly anything that agrees with Scripture, but that's not what I signed. I signed that I agreed with it as far as it agrees with Scripture. So while this is going on, you still have in small, particularly rural parishes in the Netherlands, small groups of very devout laymen who are continuing to meet in small little home groups, reading the oude schrijvers, the old writers. And there began to be unrest about the fact that the new church order allowed for people who didn't believe the historic doctrines at all to now teach. And as you can well figure out, once you start teaching it in the theological faculties in the universities, it's only a matter of time before you have pastors out there teaching. Now, in addition to the common folks who were in their little small groups reading the old writers, the oude schrijvers, You also have some intellectuals in Amsterdam and Leiden who were some pretty brainy intellectuals, frankly. Wilhelm de Costa and William Bilderdijk and Isaac de Costa, Wilhelm Bilderdijk, and a number of other intellectuals. Some of them were poets and lawyer types. They had come under the influence of an evangelical revival that had started in Switzerland known as the Revival. And it was a clear evangelical movement that sought to reinvigorate historic Orthodox Christianity. And being intellectuals, they were in contact with broader intellectual movements in Europe, especially on the European continent. And they began to also become very unhappy with the theological liberalism. Well, this is just percolating in the 1820s and into the early 1830s. But finally, it explodes in a small town in the northeast Dutch province of Groningen, in a little small town called Ulrum. Now, the town of Ulrum happens to be where a couple of my great-grandparents come from. And they were members of a church there that they had a minister by the name of Hendrik de Cock. The minister had been trained at the University of Groningen under liberal theology professors, didn't believe hardly anything that was orthodox, and he went out to pastor the church in Ulrum. Well, he had people in his church who met in small groups and read the Oude and read historic, pious-sounding Orthodox Reformed theology. One man named Klaus Scheppinga challenged de Cock. He said, I challenge you, read these Oude read Calvin. He said, read the historic documents. And de Cock said he had never even read the canons of Dort, which is interesting. I don't know how you subscribe to them insofar as they agree with Scripture if you haven't even read them, but he admitted he hadn't even read them. Well, Hendrik de Cock got a crash course in Reformed theology and became a flaming convert to historic Reformed theology. Now, he also had a very tenacious, pugnacious kind of personality. And he began challenging, criticizing his former professors, criticizing other ministers, and he got himself in trouble. Especially when very devout folks from neighboring parishes began realizing Ulrum has a dominee, is the Dutch word for minister, has a dominee who preaches the word, and he believes what the Oude teach. Well, they kept coming over and wanting to hear Reverend de Cock. They wanted him to baptize their children. They didn't want their liberal minister to baptize their children. Well, he got in trouble. He was fined, told to stop, because he was doing things which were technically illegal. A minister was not supposed to baptize the children from neighboring parishes. Well, those pious people from the neighboring parishes said, we don't want our minister to baptize my children. He didn't believe anything. I want you to baptize my child. He started meeting in a barn, and it was causing lots of turmoil. Basically, what they were using is, as soon as he started meeting in a barn, they resurrected, and those of us who are under COVID-19 and all regulations can really appreciate this, they resurrected, the authorities did, an old law that was written under the Napoleonic Code for political dissent, and used it, and it said you couldn't have more than 19 people meeting at any one time. Oh, he had a barn full of people coming to listen to him. And so they said, wrong. They fined him, put him in jail temporarily. He refused. He was defrocked from the ministry. His congregation followed him. Well, there were others that also began becoming restless. One was a man of a very different type. His name was Hendrik Schulte. Now, if you're from the state of Iowa and ever been to Pella, you will find a house called the Schulte House. Yes, that's the same Hendrik Schulte, who eventually took most of his congregation and came here to Iowa and landed in Pella. He also became restless with the liberal theology, and he was friends of a lot of these intellectuals. He was sympathetic to the theology of de Cock, and he supported him. He and some of his friends, for four of them, his close ministerial friends, became known as the Schulte Club. And it's interesting, most of those men eventually emigrated to the United States. One of them was the founder of Holland, Michigan. So these small group of Orthodox ministers are now banding together and saying something has to be done. Now, Schulte was very bothered by the fact that the intellectual leaders, the followers of the Swiss Revival evangelical movement, were sympathetic but wouldn't do anything other than give them some support legally, wouldn't leave the main Dutch church. Eventually, this movement became known in the Dutch circles as the afscheiding, the secession, because they splintered off, formed a denomination called the Christian Reformed Church of the Netherlands. And part of their claim, one that got them in lots of legal tangles, was they claimed to be the true secession of the Dutch Reformed Church. They claimed they had legal standing because they said, we didn't move, the other church, the big church, moved. So can you see that this is just the opposite? Why this is going to become important? Because we're going to discover a man named Herman Bavinck who was reared and grew up in this small splinter secessionist body. They lost a lot of people in the early days because in the 1840s, a significant number of them in 50s started coming to the United States because they found legal harassment. Finally, they stopped the legal harassment. There were enough lawsuits against the government from trying to harass them that they stopped. Schulte himself was always restless, and he got in arguments with all sorts of other people, and he was even an independent-minded guy when he came to Iowa. But there were clearly, this was a orthodox but tight separatist movement. As I said, a number of people who were very orthodox did not leave the main body. There were a couple of smaller secessions, but in the 1880s, there was another big secession in the Dutch church under a man named Abraham Kuyper, a theologian who founded a university, the Free University of Amsterdam, who eventually became the Prime Minister of the Netherlands in 1902. The only place in the world that I know of is in the Netherlands where a man goes from becoming a theology professor to becoming Prime Minister. It was also equally orthodox, but it had some very clear, distinct emphases from the movement that Herman Bavinck would be raised in. And this caused conflicts even when the two movements merged in 1892. Now we're beginning to hone onto Herman Bavinck. One of the key leaders in the Christian Reformed Church of the Netherlands, the CGKN as it's acronymed, was a minister named Jan Bavinck. Originally, he was born on the German side of the border, on a portion of Germany that is very reformed and heavily influenced by the Netherlands. They speak a dialect of Low German that's almost identical to Dutch. They were Orthodox Reformed. And Jan Bavinck was a premier minister in that denomination, and he was someone who eventually became a professor in their seminary. They founded a seminary in the town of Kampen. So, what were these folks like that Herman Bavinck was raised in? There were several streams that flowed into it, but to summarize them, they were serious, tight-lipped, orthodox people who loved the Oude-schrijvers, the old writers. They loved psalm singing. They were the strictest of strict Sabbatarians. They were opposed to dancing and card playing and all sorts of things like that, but not opposed to cigars and moderate use of alcohol. They loved their cigars and they loved their beer. But they were serious folks. In that context, we find Herman Bavinck. He was the second of 7 children born to Jan Bavinck, as I said, a minister and later theology professor at their seminary. He was a bright child, and his father saw this, and mother saw this, and gave him a very good education. And clearly, when he was graduating from high school, he aspired to the ministry. He studied at the seminary in Kampen for 1 year, the seminary his father studied at, and then shocked everybody by announcing that he wanted to go at the age of 20 to study at the University of Leiden, which was the premier theological faculty in the Netherlands, and it was totally dominated by liberals. And people in the CJKN were just shocked. It'd be like somebody here in the United States saying, well, I've studied at an evangelical college for 1 year. I think I'm going to go to the hotbed of liberalism in the United States, and it won't affect me. And young Bobbinck's friends and colleagues said, "What is your son doing? He's going to be eaten alive. He's going to be destroyed." But young Herman said, "No, I want to study theology on a very technical basis. I want to throw myself, if you will, into the lion's den and see how I survive." He went there, and even one of his good friends, Henry Dosker, who emigrated to the United States and became a professor at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, thought Herman was crazy, basically, for deciding to go to study at the University of Leiden. His own father was cautious, but said, "Yes, okay, Herman, but remember where you came from. Remember what we've taught you." There he studied under one of a world-renowned Old Testament scholar, Abraham Kunin, the theologian J.D. Scholten, and some others. Scholten was a kind of a Schleiermachian kind of theologian. Young Herman Bavinck eventually earned his doctorate there in 1880, and he kept his faith. He kept his Orthodox Reformed faith, although he admitted that it really stretched him. He came, like Machen, he came very close a few times to saying, almost throwing it off. Now, he did get a first-class education there. He became fluent in Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, French, German, and English. He knew he was fluent in all of those languages. He mastered philosophy as well as theology, which would make him one of the most philosophically astute of all modern Reformed theologians. When he went to be ordained in the CKJN, they said he got one of the most thorough theology exams anybody has ever gotten, because all of the ministers were just absolutely certain that young Herman they were not going to let young Herman come in as a crypto-liberal. But he passed. By this time, Abraham Kuyper had started his new university in Amsterdam, and he heard about this young, brilliant theologian, Herman Bavinck, and he offered him a position to teach theology in his new university. And young Herman Bavinck turned him down and took instead a call to a small church in Franeker in the province of Friesland, where he stayed for 2 years. It was a congregation made up of very ordinary folks. You remember young Herman has a doctorate in theology, but his congregation is very ordinary folks. He preached the scriptures to them. These people were very devout folks who loved the so-called oudscribers. He especially seemed to have developed a love and appreciated the opportunity to minister to handicapped folks. There were a number of young people in the church who were handicapped, and he loved ministering to them. So, 2 years. He's a pastor, a small church, till the seminary that he'd studied at for 1 year, where his father had been professor, offered him a position in 1892. He taught there until 1902, when finally, so he taught there for 20 years at the seminary in Kampen, when after many attempts, Abraham Kuyper was almost annually sending him a letter saying, "I want you at my university. I want you to come teach theology." Every time he would turn back, "No, my job is teaching ministerial candidates at the seminary in Kampen." Finally, in 1902, when Abraham Kuyper, who was teaching theology there, took the prime minister's job, finally young Herman Bavinck, who by that time was a mature theologian, took the position at the Free University. Bavinck was a popular and well-loved teacher, but he had a very different kind of personality than, let's say, Machen. If Machen was fun-loving, but also pugnacious and sort of cantankerous, if you will, at times with people he didn't agree with, Bavinck was a congenial sort of person, including being congenial with people whom he radically disagreed with. He would oftentimes, they said, come to classes when he was teaching at Kampen early, and half hour, 45 minutes at least early, an hour early, and he would meet around the stove, because they used to have pot-bellied stoves that heated the buildings, and he would let the students ask him any questions, and they would have wide-ranging discussions on literature and poetry and current events, whatever they wanted to talk about. He was one of the driving forces in bringing the separatist movement that he had been grown up in, and the movement started by Abraham Kuyper, in spite of their commonalities, but some serious differences, and we don't have time to go into what those differences were, but there were some distinct differences, bringing them together. A few people stayed out because of the differences, but he helped work to bring the majority together. and he worked hard to overcome the suspicions that some continued. Herman Bavinck then became one of the key theologians in what is sometimes called Dutch Neo-Calvinism. He, along with Abraham Kuyper, are the two leading thinkers in that movement. For years, he lived kind of in the shadow of the more flamboyant Abraham Kuyper. Kuyper was a very flamboyant sort of guy, wrote a weekly newspaper, and everybody in the Netherlands read his weekly newspaper, and he became prime minister and just very outspoken sort of man. But today, most people would say that Bavinck was by far the better theologian of the two. Bavinck, by the way, did get involved in politics and other things. He was served in the upper house of the Dutch Parliament for several terms, was knighted by the Queen, wrote in many other areas: ethics, politics, psychology, education, the Christian family, and philosophy, in addition to his many works in theology. He was a member of the Dutch Royal Academy of the Sciences. Yet he always remained the devout, Reformed Christian, faithful to his upbringing in the CKJM. Fascinating, on his deathbed, he was in his early 70s, and he had a severe heart attack, and he knew he wasn't going to survive. And one of the last things he said was this: "None of my learning, even my dogmatics, don't matter now. What matters now is my faith in Jesus Christ." Wonderful thing for someone to say on his deathbed. All of my learning, all of my dogmatics, all of my theology really don't matter. What matters now at this time is I have trust in Jesus Christ as my Savior. Now, that doesn't mean he repudiated theology, far from it, but it showed the understanding of the foundation of his life. Well, let's look briefly at his theology and his main contribution. He wrote widely in theology, in addition to many writings in many other fields. The number of those are available in Reformed translation, but as I said, his magnum opus this is volume 3 of it, his 4-volume Reformed Dogmatics, which cover the whole gamut of theology. Long available only in Dutch, it has now been translated in the last 20 years into readable English, and there's a nice, concise 1-volume summary, which is not the same, as I mentioned, as his own popular summary, which has been translated and published under 2 different titles in English: The Wonderful Works of God and Our Reasonable Faith. He lectured on a wide variety of theological topics, including an important book on debated issues in the doctrine of regeneration called Salvation by Grace, and as well as the print version of the Stone lectures he gave at Princeton Seminary in 1908, A Philosophy of Revelation. While he was here, he got a chance to meet President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt was of Dutch ancestry and wanted to meet this very famous Dutch theologian. He also left behind a massive manuscript of lectures on theological ethics, which is in the process of being translated into English. Volume 1 is available now, and will be at least 3 large volumes before it's done. But for many years, for a variety of reasons, he was late in being translated, even though he is considered overwhelmingly the foremost Reformed theologian having written in the last 100 years. And he was primarily mediated through Dutch-American theologians, such as Louis Berkhof or Cornelius Van Til. Berkhof's widely used systematic theology, which has been translated into multiple languages, was heavily dependent on Herman Bavinck. Some have said that you can take chapters of Louis Berkhof's theology, and you can go and look at the chapters in Herman Bavinck and see what Berkhof did was simply summarize and maybe slightly rearrange Bobbinx's chapter. He even used the same scripture references that Bavinck. So basically, he's taking Herman Bavinck and summarizing it and transmitting it into English. Cornelius Van Til, the famous apologist from Westminster Seminary, was heavily dependent on Bobbinx's method in developing his own distinct apologetic method, where he taught at Westminster Seminary. Some who have been critical of certain aspects of Bavinck, or of Van Til, said the various areas where Van Til will slightly deviate from Bavinck are the areas where they think Van Til is the weakest. That's a kind of an intramural debate, and there's still lots of discussions on that. But the point is that they were actually quite similar. And there are whole sections in Van Til you can see where he's being heavily dependent. Van Til was a Dutch immigrant. He actually grew up in my home area, went to church with a couple of my grandparents, and spoke Dutch as his native language. And so he was quite familiar with Bavinck. The New English translation of Bavinck's Dogmatics has given a huge boost and interest in his theology, and strangely enough, at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where noted Bavinck scholar James Eglinton teaches, has become a hotspot of Bavinck scholarship, cranking out all sorts of graduate students who are writing PhD theses on Bavinck's theology. Well, what are the main contributions of Bavinck's theology? First of all, he was a thoroughly biblical theologian who was also incredibly knowledgeable on the whole history of theology. The kind of things we're doing in this class, swamps in comparison to it. He just knew it all. He was possessed with a careful and calm Irenic temperament and always sought to find the most positive good in any scholar he interacted with. And he interacted with almost everybody, contemporary and historical. He was extremely careful, unlike Abraham Kuyper, who was speculative. Kuyper would just toss out a new idea and run with it, and it would be speculative, and people would scratch their heads and say, Abraham, what are you doing with that? That's a crazy speculative idea. Bavinck was not speculative. He worked with the historically given material and worked for clarity of thought. And his students have said that he was in class always careful to say that the position that he believed was most biblical, he would always point out what he still thought were issues that needed to be worked out. He was not, in other words, he was very much of a person who was recognized that his own theology would sometimes have areas that needed improvement. However, what almost everyone who's worked with Herman Bavinck has highlighted, was his Catholic with a small c spirit. One author put it this way: it's a great irony that one of the truly most ecumenically minded, in the proper sense, Reformed theologians came from a small separatist seminary in the small country of the Netherlands. Here, let me read that again. This scholar said it's one of the great ironies that this scholar who was raised in this sort of cantankerous sectarian branch of the Reformed faith, who taught at a small sectarian-minded seminary, became one of the most ecumenical, Catholic with the small c, of all Reformed theologians. He was an Orthodox Reformed theologian, and all of his theology was that sort of theology. Yet he was willing to find truth in any source that he could. He put it this way. He said, the great theologians of the past were a great cloud of witnesses, picking up the theme from Hebrews, to the truth of the Church Catholic in all of its manifestations. And he says, these great cloud of witnesses are for all of us to learn from. He would have loved the idea of this class. We learn from old dead guys. And he did. Certainly this means the historic Reformed theologians, starting with the Reformers. After all, he wrote his doctoral thesis on Zwingli. He knew the Reformed Orthodox theologians of the 17th and 18th century. He knew the American Princetonian theologians. He knew everything. He also knew, he was incredibly knowledgeable with the Lutheran tradition and the Roman Catholic tradition. He knew modern liberalism firsthand. He had studied with the University of Leiden with liberal theologians. And it's with a couple of the latter that I want to give you a couple of examples of his so-called Catholic spirit. Bavinck remained thoroughly Orthodox, but he showed an appreciation for an aspect of Friedrich Schleiermacher, the founder of liberalism, emphasis on absolute dependence. He borrowed the idea, reworked it, and used it to answer some of the philosophical objections against the historic Christian faith set forth by Immanuel Kant. He believed Schleiermacher's insight was of great help in understanding the universal sense of religious feeling found in everybody. For example, people have studied his references to Schleiermacher and said 90% of his references are negative, which if you're an Orthodox theologian, you would have 90% negative responses. But he found a couple of key ideas in Schleiermacher that he said could be useful in explicating and developing Orthodox Reformed theology. Now, some people have noticed this and said there was a kind of a theory going around about 20 years ago called the two Bavinck theories. There was the Orthodox Bavinck, and then there was this other Bavinck who dabbled and liked modern liberal theologians. But recent studies have shown that this is not correct. There's one Bavinck, the theologian who organically borrows ideas from any source, including Schleiermacher, in setting forth his version of the Orthodox Christian faith. He took this idea from Schleiermacher and blended it with ideas found in Calvin and Augustine on the innate knowledge of God, and then used it in collaboration with the material out of Romans 1 and 2 to say human beings have an innate knowledge of God. Schleiermacher understood that, he just did the wrong thing with it. Orthodox Reformed theology based on Scripture does the right thing with it, but Schleiermacher can show us there is an innate sense, knowledge of God, of our dependence upon God. By the way, Augustine was the theologian that shows up in his footnotes more than any theologian. He also used ideas from Thomas Aquinas, especially as mediated by late 19th century Roman Catholic Neo-Thomist theologians, and Bavinck said he was going to develop a truly Catholic, with the small c again, theology, because he said Roman Catholicism was not really Catholic, because it had a corrupted doctrine of salvation. And he worked with some ideas found with Thomas Aquinas, that he found in Aquinas, and many of these ideas also are ideas that Aquinas had found in Augustine. So here he's working with two sources, liberalism, Roman Catholicism, in the help of developing an Orthodox Reformed theology. Now, this ironic nature, this willingness to see good in the theology, even of liberal theologians and even in Roman Catholics, oftentimes irritated his good friend Abraham Kuyper, who was combative by nature. What did Bavinck think? Well, first of all, he thought his friend Abraham Kuyper's combativeness led him to be arrogant at times. And the one thing Herman Bavinck was not was arrogant. He said it also meant that Abraham Kuyper was domineering at times, especially in the Dutch political party that both of them were active in. To summarize, Bavinck was a Trinitarian theologian who, like most of these neo-Calvinist theologians, worked with ideas of creation as a foundation. God's grace does not destroy creation, but restores it through the work of the Holy Spirit, through the work of Christ. Another example of this would be he had a strong doctrine of the imitation of Christ, like the kind normally associated with the Anabaptist tradition. Well, you might say, what's that all about? The Anabaptists, the Mennonites and Amish, have a strong emphasis of following in Jesus' footsteps. Well, Herman Bavinck said that while this is not normally associated with the Reformed tradition, it's a good, legitimate way, and we can see that the Anabaptists are right in what they're saying here. Drawing upon Philippians 2, he demonstrated that this was also found in Calvin. This enabled him to give a generous review of the liberal American pastor Charles Sheldon's book In His Steps. He reviewed it and he said, I don't like his liberal theology, but he's right. We should do what Jesus did. This is probably the original WWJD movement, Sheldon's movement. Now, many have argued that this emphasis on the imitation of Christ kept him from some of the kind of triumphalism that his colleague Abraham Kuyper had, and who talked a lot about cultural transformation and sometimes forgot about personal piety and personal devotion. But with this emphasis on the imitation of Christ, it gave Bavinck a tempering of the triumphalism that his colleague Abraham Kuyper had. Above all, Herman Bavinck wanted to be fully Catholic in the best sense in his theology, and he returned to that theme many times in his writings and lectures. It was the theme of his inaugural address when he was installed as professor of theology at the seminary, and his last theological writing before he died, was on the theme of the Catholicity of the faith. He's today the favorite theologian of a movement which has developed in the last 10, 15 years called Reformed Catholicity, a movement that I have a lot of particular respect for. Since he wanted to retrieve from the past, but always using it in a thoroughly up-to-date way to serve the Church Catholic, again with a small c, in his theologizing. He said we must retrieve theology from the past, but always use it in the culture in which we find ourselves and not just to repeat the past. For Herman Bavinck, there was no pristine area of theology we have to go back to, like some people say. Rather, we draw upon the theology of the whole history of the church to build a theology for today. And that's what many people who are in the Reformed Catholicity movement are saying why Herman Bavinck is such an important theologian. Well, to summarize, what do we learn from these two theologians? First of all, Machen shows us the boundaries between liberalism and true Orthodox Christianity. He reminds us that there are battles for truth that need to be fought, and sometimes these can be institutionally painful. Machen got kicked out of his church for standing for the truth. Bavinck reminds us that all truth with the capital T, if it's truth, is God's truth. And we should mine, M-I-N-E, the whole of the Christian tradition in our theology. No one era, including the modern evangelicalism that many of us have grown up in, is the pristine era of the church. We must be thoroughly biblical, but always checking our biblical ideas against what our forefathers have taught and restating it in the context of our current culture. So these two theologians show us the boundaries within which we run and the attitude that we have when we run within those boundaries. And I would, as we conclude this class, which I very much enjoyed teaching, and I hope that this is something that all of you have benefited from, just want to encourage you to read Bobbink's own summary of his theology and Machen's Christianity and Liberalism as you wrestle with what kind of theology should we develop as we move into 20th century culture, a culture that needs both boundaries and a Catholic spirit as we work within those boundaries. Thanks.